I exalt you, Lord, because you hold me up. You didn't let my enemies celebrate over me. Lord, my God, I cry out to you for help, and you heal me. Lord, you brought me back from the grave, brought me back to life from among those going down to the pit. You who are faithful to the Lord, sing praises to him. Give thanks to his holy name. God's anger lasts for only a second, but God's favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay all night, but by morning joy. When I was comfortable, I said, I will never stumble, because it pleased you, Lord. You made me a strong mountain, but then you gave your presence. I was terrified. I cried out to you, Lord. I begged my Lord for mercy. What is the gain by my spilled blood, by my going down to the pit? Does dust thank you? Does it proclaim your faithfulness? You changed my mourning into dancing. You took off my funeral clothes and dressed me up in joy, so that my whole being might sing praises to you and never stop. Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. All creation is the word of God. All creation speaks volumes of God.
Lord, may the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Anna was a retired attorney living in Philadelphia. Her life began to unravel in 2005 when her husband of some 30 years announced that he was leaving her for another woman. She had never expected her marriage to end, and while dealing with the fact that it had, she found herself feeling tired, feeling restless, and thinking, it's all my fault. I messed everything up. I am a worthless human being. Now, understand that none of this is really fact. And nothing that she did really required those kinds of conclusions. But nonetheless, Anna could not escape her feelings. She tried antidepressants, but that only made things worse. So searching for help, she eventually found a friend who encouraged her to try a new counselor who was working in a field called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps patients to approach their emotional problems using their critical thinking. Here people learn to identify self-destructive thought patterns in their life, and as individuals do that, they are able to obsess less over their problems and begin to give themselves more credit for the positive things in their life. A couple examples of these things that help to block our good thinking, our cognitive distortions, as they would call them, our labeling. When we assign kind of a global word to someone saying, I am totally undesirable. He is a totally rotten person. I am so inadequate. Or maybe we just discount any positives that are offered our way. Kind of a favorite Minnesota game. But you claim anything someone says to you positive as something that's only trivial. Or maybe blaming is your cognitive distortion, where you focus on the other person as the source of your negative feelings, and you refuse to take any responsibility for yourself in what has happened. Or maybe it's playing the what-if game. What if this hadn't have happened? What if this does happen? What if? And it just gets you into a cycle and has you like a dog chasing its tail. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help people to learn to identify self-destructive thought patterns and replace them with clearer thinking. As one learns to identify and name the distortions, the illogical thoughts, they can say that it has a mental spin, and the person is able to lower the volume of these messages in their head and the internal troublemaking things that they do, if not turn them off altogether. As one learns to do that, one does obsess less over problems and begins to give themselves more credit for positive things in their life. Now this morning, it's not my purpose to praise this cognitive behavioral therapy or to tell you that you need to put a psychiatrist on your local speed dial. But today's reading from Psalm 30 suggests some other possibilities, and yet, surprisingly, they align themselves with these principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. Let us begin by looking at that 5th verse of Psalm 30, where it says, God's anger is but for a moment. His favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes in the morning. The theological distortions or the illogical faith thought patterns are that God's anger is forever, or that weeping, feeling sad is forever, is unending. The psalmist recognizes that neither of these are true. So he corrects and adjusts his thinking, remembering the positive reality that joy comes in the morning. He uses his critical thinking, if you will, to put his troubles into a perspective that he relies on the nature of God that he has known and God's track record that he has experienced, that's alluded to in verses 1 through 3 and 11, where the psalmist says, Lord, I cried to you for help, and you healed me. This can be a physical healing and can be an emotional healing as well. Or the psalmist says, you brought me up from Sheol and restored me to life. Lord, you pulled me up and did not let my enemies rejoice over me. You turned my mourning into dancing, and you took off my sackcloth or funeral clothes and clothed me with joy. The psalmist understands that the nature of God to be that which has healed him, the nature of God is that which has restored him back to life. It has pulled him through tough times when he was down, so that his enemies couldn't rejoice over him. And he says that the very nature of God is that God has turned his mourning into dancing and has clothed him with joy. And Psalm 30 is not the only text in the Bible that points us in this direction of needing to change our critical thinking and reorient our life and our minds. In the New Testament, in the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern that which is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Did you hear that? Clear thinking can help you discern God's will, help you discern God's way, help you to discern God's nature. Melanie Silva is a writer of worship resources and author of the prayer that Steve read for us this morning, or led us in as we prayed it together. In her reflections on Psalm 30, she reflects upon how she applies it to everyday life and says that the idea of thinking our way out of mental traps connects with the experience of grief. That is, in times of grief, we often feel that life is like it's always going to be like this. I'm always going to feel this way. I'm always going to feel gloomy, down, sad, and dark. She says that in the throes of grief, it's like slogging through a marsh or a swamp, or climbing a shale-sided mountain, only to take a step up and then slide back down. It's hard to think of your life will ever be better, or that your life will ever be different. But returning to Psalm 30, Silva says, joy does come in the morning, but you cannot get to the morning without going through the night. She says, I give kudos to the people who choose to walk through the valley of grief, and thus with great effort recreate their lives. Such work can change the tapes that we have heard playing in our minds, sometimes even since childhood. And it's hard to think that they will ever be different. But we can recreate our lives and changing them to a more healthy way to see things. Joy does not come without cost, but God is with us in the process and will call out when we call out to God for help. Early in my ministry, I first met a parishioner when she celebrated her 95th birthday. We lived in a town of about 1,200 in northwest Illinois at that time, and she had lived in that area all of her life. When I would call on her, she was the type of woman who would always insist that we had tea and cookies as a part of the visit of the pastor. And through the next 12 or so years, in times she had to cut back on her baking, and we ate store-bought cookies. And in the last years, when she was about 105 or 107 and was in the nursing home, when I came to see her, I would bring the cookies, and the staff would make the tea. Blanche had a beautiful mind. She could think through life situations and relate them in common, no-sense understandings. One time we talked, I remembered I asked her about life and loss, and what she had learned and what she would like to share. She looked at me, as she would often start conversations of reflection, and say, well, you know, Fred and I were married for 62 years. Fred had passed many years before that. But they had been married for 62 years. She would say next that he wasn't perfect, but maybe I wasn't either, but he was a good man. And they had a good life together. And then after a few moments of silence and some reflective thinking, she paused and said, you have to be grateful for what you have had, not what you've lost. Every day in my prayers, she said, and she did this. She had duplicate prayer lists that she kept, one on her kitchen table next to her Bible and her daily devotional of the upper room, and the other at her bedstand in her bedroom, with 100 or so names on it. One time she asked me, she said, if I fall asleep in the middle of my prayers doing them at night, do you think God will forgive me? I said, I think God understands. She even had Sue and I and our family near the top of the list. She said, every day in my prayers, I give thanks to God for Fred and the life we had together. Every day I thank God for what we had. I'm so blessed. Remember, Tom, she said, life is about being grateful for what you had, not what you've lost. Now, Blanche would not have thought of herself as a cognitive behavioral thinker. But her thoughtful, grateful outlook on life and her faith in a God who loved her, who helped her, who healed her, a God who lifted her up when she was down, a God whose favor she knew for a lifetime, and a God who turned her mourning into dancing. Let us pray. Gracious God, we come to you this morning, pause in these moments, and turn our thoughts and minds and hearts to you. So speak to us the words of grace we seek this day, and hear us as we offer this prayer which Jesus taught as they prayed together and said, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy